The village looked peaceful from the outside, the kind of place travelers passed through without a second thought. But anyone who lived there knew the truth. Calm on the surface, storms underneath. Fear had been growing there for years, spreading in small ways at first, settling into people's habits, tightening their beliefs, shaping the way they looked at one another. It showed in the way neighbors closed their doors a little faster at night, in the way voices dropped when a stranger walked by, in the way people watched each other with the quiet suspicion that someone, somewhere, must be the enemy. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Fear had become the village's unofficial law. It didn't start with violence. It started with stories. One person accused another of something small, then the next week someone else whispered about a wrong that might have happened, then someone claimed they saw something they probably didn't. Every rumor became a grain of sand, and the village built entire dunes out of them. Over time, truth became optional. Rumor and certainty were treated the same, and once that line blurred, people stopped caring which was which. They just wanted someone to blame. Blame was easy. Blame was comforting. Blame felt like control. Leaders in the village played into it. A few loud voices discovered they could steer the crowd by sparking fear at the right moment. They didn't have to prove anything. They only had to say it with enough confidence. And because fear makes people hungry for answers, the village accepted anything that sounded firm. The loudest speakers became the ones everyone followed. Not because they were wise, but because they were sure. And when people are scared, certainty feels like safety, even when it's dangerous. The village fell into a rhythm. Something went wrong, someone got accused. A bad harvest? Blame the newcomer. A missing goat? Blame the widow who lived near the fields. A sick child? Blame anyone who looked different, or spoke differently, or stepped out of line. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that someone paid the price so the rest could feel protected. These moments brought the crowd together, but not in a way that built community. It was unity forged in fear, and unity born from fear always demands a target. Once you become the target, nothing you say saves you. The crowd wants resolution, not truth. People who knew better stayed quiet. A few tried to speak up early on, but one by one they learned that questioning the crowd made you look like you were hiding something. And once suspicion landed on you, it stuck like tar. Anyone who spoke against an accusation risked becoming the next accused. So reasonable people stopped being reasonable in public. They kept their doubts to themselves. Silence, in that village, became a survival skill. Visitors sensed the tension, but never understood how deep it ran. They felt the eyes watching them, felt the tightness in the air, but unless you lived there long enough, you couldn't see how the fear worked. You wouldn't know that a wrong word at the wrong time could light a fuse. You wouldn't notice the unspoken rules everyone followed. You wouldn't realize how close to the edge the village always was. Outsiders saw quiet streets. Insiders heard the crackling under them. That was the world the woman walked into. She was new enough that she didn't know the signs. She didn't understand the old grudges, the hidden rivalries, the weight of years filled with suspicion. She didn't know whose family hated whose, or which rumors never died, or who carried grudges like stones in their pockets. She didn't know which traditions mattered or which lines you didn't cross. And in a place ruled by fear, ignorance is dangerous. Mistakes don't stay small. They get fed by whispers, stretched by gossip, and reshaped into something darker. When the rumor about her began, no one bothered to check the facts. They didn't need to. The story fit the mood of the village. It confirmed their fears. It gave them a clear villain, and once people decided she was the villain, everything she did looked suspicious. Every gesture was a sign. Every silence a confession. Every defense a lie. It didn't matter that there was no proof. Proof wasn't the point. The village didn't want truth. It wanted certainty. It wanted an answer big enough to quiet the fear that had been building for years. And when fear becomes the judge, the verdict is always decided long before the accused gets a chance to speak. She stood in the center of the crowd with her hands tied. But it wasn't the rope that trapped her. It was the way every eye in that village looked at her, as if she had already confessed. No one asked her what happened. No one bothered to hear her side. They believed the story before she even knew she had been accused. And once a story catches fire in a place like that, the truth doesn't stand a chance. She was condemned long before sunrise, not by evidence, but by the weight of people who needed someone to carry their fear for them. She had always kept to herself, which should have meant nothing, but in a village where everyone watched everyone else, quiet people became targets. She arrived only months earlier, hoping for a fresh start, hoping for a place where she could rebuild the pieces of her life. She took small jobs, helped when she could, smiled at the market, and worked hard to show she belonged. But belonging isn't something the village offered easily. They kept her at arm's length, polite but guarded. A newcomer was a blank page, and blank pages scare people who spend their days reading between lines that don't exist. The accusation fell on her like a stone from the sky. No warning, no conversation, not even a misunderstanding she could point to. One night, she went to bed unknown. By morning, half the village whispered her name with a tone that made her skin crawl. They didn't accuse her of a crime rooted in fact. They accused her of the kind of wrongdoing that thrives in places where logic has been eroded. Something vague, something shadowy, something impossible to disprove. Rumors painted her as dangerous in a dozen different ways, each one stretching further than the last, until the entire story became a beast made of other people's fears. And once they believed she was dangerous, every memory of her changed shape. A child remembered she looked too calm the day a storm came. A farmer recalled she walked alone too often. A shopkeeper decided she asked too many questions about prices. People accused her with fragments so thin they would have been laughable anywhere else, but the village took those fragments and built a wall around her. They told each other she had been odd from the beginning, that they should have known, that the signs had been there. It didn't matter that the signs were invented after the fact. Fear rewrites history to justify itself. She tried to speak, but each time she opened her mouth, someone talked over her. They didn't want to hear her voice. Her voice complicated things. Her voice reminded them she was a person, and they needed her to be something else. They needed her to be the villain so they could be the righteous ones. They needed to believe the danger wasn't inside their own choices, their own unchecked suspicion, their own willingness to follow the loudest voices. They needed a simple story. She became that story. When they dragged her out of her small home, she didn't resist. Resistance would have been twisted into guilt. Silence was seen as confirmation. Speaking was seen as defiance. Every choice she made would be used against her. She knew that. She saw it in their eyes. She saw it in the way they formed a tight circle around her, as if she carried a contagious curse. She tried to catch someone's gaze, anyone's, hoping to find one person who still saw her as human. But whenever she met a pair of eyes, they dropped or narrowed. No one wanted to break from the crowd. No one wanted to risk suspicion spreading to them. Her isolation became complete. They marched her into the square, and she felt the shift in the air, the one that happens when a group convinces itself it is doing the right thing. There was a strange calm to it, the calm of people who no longer question themselves. They spoke about justice, but what they meant was closure. They wanted the tension that had been growing in the village to be released in a single act, and she was the outlet they chose. She tried to ask what proof they had, but proof wasn't part of the process. Proof would have required thought. They were beyond thinking. They were committed. The worst part wasn't the rope waiting for her. It wasn't the hands that pushed her forward or the voices that demanded she confess. The worst part was knowing that the truth had become irrelevant. Nothing she said mattered. Nothing she didn't say mattered. Her fate had been sealed in conversations she wasn't present for, in decisions made by people who never tried to know her, in fears that had nothing to do with her at all. She wasn't condemned for what she did. She was condemned because the village needed someone to blame, and she was the easiest one to choose. They gathered before the sun finished rising, called by nothing more than whispers and the pull of shared outrage. No bells, no summons, no official announcement. The crowd formed on its own, driven by the kind of momentum that starts slow and then swells until it feels unstoppable. People stepped out of their homes, each one telling themselves they were only going to watch, only going because everyone else was. But once they reached the square and saw the platform being prepared, something in them shifted. They weren't observers anymore. They were participants. The air carried a strange mix of excitement and dread. Some people murmured to each other, unable to hide the thrill of being part of something dramatic. Others stood stiff, arms crossed, trying to convince themselves they were there out of duty, not curiosity. Children clung to their parents' clothes, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't understand what. The older villagers took their usual places near the front, their faces set, as if they were attending a ritual carved into the history of the place. Rumors had brought them here, but now the crowd fed itself. At the center of the square stood the gallows. Rough wood, a rope that looked too new, too clean for its purpose. The man who tied the knot had done it with quiet precision, avoiding eye contact with anyone watching him. He acted like a person performing a chore he didn't want to question. If he questioned it, he'd have to question everything that led to this morning. So he focused on the rope. He pulled it tight. He tested its strength. The crowd watched each move as if the knot itself proved the woman's guilt. People talked in low voices, but every conversation followed the same pattern. They reminded each other why they were there. They repeated the accusations, sharpening them each time they spoke. No one asked whether the story made sense. No one questioned the lack of proof. Each retelling became a chant of reassurance. If enough people believed it, then it had to be true. A few villagers raised doubts quietly, but their doubts were drowned by louder voices insisting that action had to be taken. Those louder voices carried the day. In a crowd, the loudest emotions always win. There was a strange comfort in being part of the group. Individuals who might have hesitated on their own felt braver, or at least less responsible, when they stood shoulder to shoulder with others. Moral weight spreads thin in a crowd. Decisions don't feel personal. Blame becomes communal. People told themselves that the hanging was necessary to keep the peace, to protect the village, to send a message. Deep down, some of them knew they were lying to themselves, but they pushed the thought away. It was easier to believe the story than admit they were acting out of fear. As more people arrived, the crowd thickened. Some brought stools to stand on so they could see better. Others leaned out from windows, craning their necks. A few sellers even set up small baskets of bread and fruit, as if this gathering were any other public event. That was the unsettling part. The hanging had become a spectacle, something to witness, something to talk about later. The woman's life had been reduced to an occasion for entertainment, punishment, and collective release. Every face reflected something different. Some looked hardened, already locked into the belief that this was justice. Some looked unsure, caught between the pressure of the crowd and the nagging thought that something felt wrong. Others looked eager, drawn in by the adrenaline of the moment. In the back, a few stood apart, their expressions heavy with discomfort, not brave enough to leave, not willing enough to step forward. The crowd held them all in place. When the guards pulled the woman into the square, the shift was immediate. Conversation stopped. Breathing slowed. Every head turned toward her. That silence was louder than any shout. It carried judgment. It carried expectation. The crowd had been preparing for this moment, building itself up with words and whispers, and now the final act had arrived. People leaned forward without realizing it. They wanted to see her face. They wanted to see guilt written in her expression, because seeing it would make them feel justified. Some in the crowd yelled for her to confess. Others told her to look at them. A few shouted insults they would never have dared to say if they were alone. The power of the crowd loosened their restraint. Behind those voices were people who had persuaded themselves they were speaking for the village, for safety, for order. They didn't recognize that they were speaking out of fear disguised as righteousness. The rope swayed lightly in the morning air, and eyes drifted toward it again and again. It was the symbol of finality, the tool that would complete the story they had built together. The crowd wasn't just gathering to watch a hanging. They were gathering to validate a belief. They needed the rope to prove they were right, that their fear was justified, that their suspicion had a target. And as they waited, the crowd became something larger than any single person in it, something harder, colder, and more dangerous than they understood. He didn't arrive with fanfare. No trumpet of authority, no display of rank, no attempt to push through the crowd with force. He walked into the square like any other man, but people shifted without knowing why. They moved aside instinctively, the way grass parts for a strong wind. His posture was straight, his steps measured, and there was something in his eyes that made people quiet themselves even before they recognized who he was. Word traveled fast. A Navy SEAL colonel was in the crowd. Someone whispered his name. Someone else whispered that he'd served in places where most people wouldn't survive a single night. And suddenly the atmosphere changed, not because he demanded it, but because people sensed a different kind of presence. He didn't go to the front because he wanted attention. He walked there because he needed a clear view. The villagers watched him with a mix of curiosity and unease. They wondered why he was there. They wondered what he would say. But he didn't speak. Not yet. He stood still, arms at his sides, observing everything with an expression that gave nothing away. He watched the woman, the rope, the platform, the crowd, the men holding her arms, the knot that had been tied too well. He noticed the tension in the air, every unspoken doubt, every forced bravado. He saw the whole scene with the accuracy of someone trained to read danger in every detail. The colonel didn't see a criminal. He didn't see a threat. He saw a woman whose voice had been taken from her. He saw a crowd leaning on fear instead of truth. Years of service had taught him what happens when people stop questioning themselves. He had seen what fear can make ordinary people do. He had witnessed crowds turn into mobs, intentions twist into violence, justice dissolve into something darker. And he knew that once a group crosses that line, it becomes almost impossible for them to pull themselves back. A few villagers tried to explain what was happening, eager to justify themselves before he asked. They spoke over each other, repeating the same story he had already overheard on his way in. He listened quietly, but he didn't nod along. He didn't show agreement. He didn't interrupt, but he didn't validate their words either. His silence unsettled them. They expected a man of his stature to approve, or at least acknowledge their claims. Instead, he gave them nothing. They began to talk faster, stumbling over their own explanations, sensing that their certainty was slipping. Someone told him the rumors. Someone else told him the accusations. They expected him to be impressed by the list of supposed signs and strange coincidences. But he had spent a lifetime distinguishing noise from truth. What he heard was noise. Loud, emotional, inconsistent noise. He asked one question, then another, then another. Simple questions. Direct questions. Questions anyone with real evidence should have answered easily. But the answers faltered. The stories didn't align. Details shifted. Witnesses contradicted each other without even noticing. The crowd grew restless as his questions cut through their assumptions. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He didn't scold. His tone stayed calm, level, almost neutral, but every question he asked peeled back another layer of the crowd's illusion. People began to realize how thin their certainty was. But no one wanted to admit it out loud. They were too far in. The platform was built. The rope was tied. The woman was bound. Admitting the truth now would mean admitting they had nearly killed an innocent person. And pride can be as dangerous as fear. The colonel looked at the woman again. She stood trembling, though she tried to hide it. She tried to stay upright, to keep her dignity in a moment where dignity had been stripped from her. Her eyes met his for a second. Not with hope, not with plea, just a tired acceptance that he recognized too well. The acceptance of someone who no longer expects to be saved. That was the moment he stepped forward. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask the crowd to reconsider. He didn't call for a council or a vote. He moved with the certainty of someone who had decided that action mattered more than approval. The villagers whispered nervously as he approached the platform. Some told him to stop. Some told him to listen to the people. Others warned that the village had the right to handle its own justice. He didn't respond. He kept walking. Two men stood near the woman. They tightened their grip when they saw him coming, unsure whether to challenge him or step aside. He met their eyes, not with threat, but with a quiet authority that made them release her without realizing they had done it. He stepped onto the platform. The crowd held its breath. No one knew what he would do. He reached for the rope, studied the knot, and placed his hand on the hemp fibers that were meant to end her life. His movements were deliberate, controlled, unshaken. People watched in stunned silence as he pulled the blade from his belt. He lifted the rope slightly, enough to relieve the tension, and then he cut it. The moment his blade touched the rope, The square fell into a silence that felt heavier than any shout. The crowd had expected a speech, maybe a warning, maybe an order backed by authority. They had prepared themselves for negotiation, for argument, for some dramatic clash of words that would let them defend their choices. They had prepared for everything except the quiet finality of a man who acted instead of talked. When the fibers split and the rope fell limp, the sound was small, almost delicate, but it cut deeper than any accusation that had been thrown that morning. People stared, unsure if they had actually seen it happen. The colonel didn't raise the severed rope like a trophy. He didn't look around for approval. He simply lowered the blade, stepped back from the woman, and gave her space to breathe. She didn't move at first. Her knees wobbled, the shock hitting her harder than the fear had. For hours she had been preparing herself for death. Her mind had already begun to accept a fate she never deserved. When the rope fell, the change was too sudden to process. She looked at it on the ground as if it belonged to another story, not hers. The men who had been holding her took a step back. Their hands hovered awkwardly at their sides, unsure whether to restrain her again or pretend they had never touched her. The colonel didn't look at them. His calm dismissal of their authority was louder than any reprimand. Without saying a word, he made it clear that the moment of mob justice was over. The crowd felt the shift before they understood it. Something had been broken when the rope was cut, and it wasn't just the knot. It was the illusion that they were in control. People began talking again, but the tone had changed. No more loud declarations. No more confident accusations. Their voices were softer now, threaded with uncertainty. Some asked each other what the colonel thought he was doing. Others whispered that maybe he knew something they didn't. A few clung stubbornly to the belief that the hanging should continue, but those voices no longer held the same weight. The rope lying on the platform stole their momentum. It reminded them that their certainty had rested on something fragile, and now that fragility was exposed. A few approached the colonel cautiously, demanding explanations. They said the village had its own laws. They said he had no right to interfere. They said the woman was dangerous. But the conviction in their words had thinned. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply asked them to present the evidence they claimed to have. Real evidence. Not rumors. Not stories passed from person to person until they lost their shape. Evidence. They offered none. Their silence grew longer with every attempt to speak. The colonel kept his stance steady, not as a conqueror, but as a man drawing a boundary no one else dared to draw. He didn't threaten them with his title or his training. He didn't need to. His presence alone reminded them that courage does not shout. It does not demand. It does not hide behind crowds. Courage stands alone when it has to. And that is what unsettled them the most. They had depended on the crowd to carry their fear. He carried his conviction by himself. The woman slowly pulled her hands free from the rope that still circled her wrists. Her fingers trembled as she loosened the knots. She looked from the colonel to the crowd, confused, exhausted, unsure whether she was safe or simply living through a brief pause before another wave of accusations. The colonel stepped slightly to the side, not shielding her completely, but giving her room to exist without being pressed by a circle of eyes. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt like the only kindness she had been offered in weeks. Some villagers stepped back from the platform. Others stayed frozen. A few lowered their heads, not out of shame, but out of the slow realization that they had nearly watched something irreversible. There were no speeches from the colonel telling them what they had done wrong. He understood something they didn't. That moral lessons shouted at a crowd rarely take root. What stays with people are the moments when someone shows them the truth through action. His blade cutting the rope had spoken louder than any argument he could have made. The woman's breathing steadied. She touched her wrists, then the place where the rope had hung inches above her head. The crowd expected her to cry or collapse, but she stayed upright, holding what little strength she still had. The colonel met her eyes again. That single look told her she was no longer alone. Not rescued. Not saved. Just no longer abandoned. And that was enough for now. The cut rope lay across the platform like a question the villagers didn't know how to answer. The colonel had turned their certainty into doubt with one quiet motion. The square, moments earlier charged with anticipation, had shifted into something uneasy and exposed. The weight of the crowd no longer pressed forward. It hesitated. It reconsidered. It retreated. And all of it began with the simple, undeniable act of a man lifting a blade and choosing to sever what everyone else had accepted. What happened after the rope fell was not dramatic in the way crowds expect. There was no clash, no burst of applause, no sweeping declaration of victory. The colonel didn't take a triumphant stance or look around to see who supported him. He stood there quietly, letting the moment settle. His silence made the crowd confront something they had forgotten. Real courage is rarely loud. It doesn't celebrate itself. It doesn't need validation or praise. It reveals itself through choices that cost something, choices that carry weight. And the colonel had taken on that weight alone. People watched him carefully, waiting for the next move. They wanted to know whether he intended to challenge them directly, whether he would call out names or accuse the accusers. But he did none of that. He simply remained steady, his posture calm, his expression unchanged. The message was clear without him saying a word. He had acted because action was needed, not because he wanted to prove anything to the crowd. That distinction unsettled them. They were used to motives tied to anger, pride, revenge, or fear. They weren't familiar with quiet integrity standing on its own. A few villagers tried to regain control of the scene. They insisted that the hanging must continue, that the colonel had overstepped, that he didn't understand the village or its traditions. Their words were sharper now, not because they were certain, but because they felt their certainty slipping. They wanted to reclaim the momentum that had carried them this far. But the power they had before was gone. Their voices didn't stir the crowd like they had earlier. People listened, but without conviction. Doubt had settled into the cracks. Others looked at the woman, really looked at her for the first time. Now that the rope was no longer hanging above her, she didn't look like the monster the rumors had painted. She looked like a person who had been pushed to the edge by people who barely knew her. The absence of a noose revealed her humanity again, and that was something the crowd had avoided seeing. Fear had made them blind. Now, freed from the spectacle, their own judgments became harder to justify. The colonel helped her step down from the platform, not with grand gestures, but with the simple courtesy of someone who understood what she had just endured. His hand was steady, practical, respectful. He didn't guide her like she was fragile. He treated her as an equal, a person who had been wronged, not a victim who needed pity. The crowd saw this and felt the weight of what they had almost done. Some lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably. A few took a silent step back, distancing themselves from the events even though they had been part of them all along. The woman looked at the ground as if expecting it to swallow her. She wasn't ready to lift her head and face the people who had nearly ended her life. The colonel didn't rush her. He stood beside her with the quiet patience of someone who had witnessed too many scenes like this in places far harsher than the village. He knew that survival comes not only from escaping death, but from finding a way to stand again after the danger has passed. A few villagers finally approached, slower than before, carrying apologies they didn't know how to form. Their faces were pale with embarrassment. Their words stumbled in their throats. But the colonel didn't make it easy for them. He didn't tell them she forgave them. He didn't offer them comfort. He let their discomfort do its work. He knew some lessons only sink in when people feel the full weight of their mistakes without being shielded from the consequences. Even the loudest voices grew quiet. The men who had tied the rope avoided looking at the colonel. They untied the remaining knots with trembling fingers. The platform, once the center of the crowd's energy, now looked like something shameful, a relic of a decision they no longer wanted to claim. The colonel didn't call them out. He didn't need to. The truth stood there fully exposed, and they could no longer hide behind the crowd's momentum. What stayed with the villagers most was how little the colonel said. He had faced down their fear, their anger, their misguided certainty, all without shouting or threatening. He had shown them that righteousness doesn't need volume. That authority is strongest when it is grounded in principle instead of pride. That courage is measured not in words, but in choices that protect the innocent even when those choices isolate you. The woman took a breath that didn't shake. The colonel nodded once, as if telling her she didn't need to fear the crowd anymore. She wasn't saved by luck or mercy. She was saved because someone refused to let fear decide her fate. The villagers watched the two of them, realizing something they hadn't considered. Courage isn't contagious in the way fear is. It doesn't spread through crowds. It shows up in a single person who decides enough is enough. And that single person forces everyone else to confront who they have become. The colonel didn't ask for gratitude. He didn't look for recognition. He simply stood firm, his calm presence holding the entire square in check, showing through one decisive action that doing what is right rarely earns applause, but it always leaves a mark.